Morning everyone, welcome to another A-Level Geography revision session. Today we're going to look at this question, explain why some IGOs, international government organizations, have promoted liberal market and trade policies for economic development. 8 marks. So for the breakdown of this question, this could be covered in the health, human rights and intervention topic, as well as the globalization topic. So you're covering both in one today. Now, to get 8 marks, you need to demonstrate accurate and relevant geographical knowledge and understanding throughout, and the understanding addresses a broad range of geographical ideas which are detailed and fully developed. Before you start answering this question, my strong suggestion for you would be to break the components down of the question itself. Remember, this is a explain question, and then you need to refer to specific IGOs and demonstrate your understanding of what a liberal market economy is and trade policies are in the role of economic development. So on the left-hand side here, you've got the international government organizations, World Bank, the IMF, UNESCO, OECD, and the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Likelihood is that you've probably heard of the World Bank and the IMF. You probably may have heard of UNESCO, and to some extent you may have heard of OECD. Unlikely that you've heard of the last one on this list, the UNCTAD. So take the time to get your textbook out, get your notes, and write down some bullet points on how they are important or influential in the role of economic development. That will form really good revision for you, as well as helping you to revise the key bits of information and help you to structure a strong answer as well. So always remember, before you start answering the question, any question which is a long answer question, particularly at A level, spend some time looking at the key words within the question itself and write some bullet points down before you start answering it. So in this case, it's an explain question, so you're not going to have to write a very detailed conclusion or anything like that. You just need to focus on different factors. You're going to talk about different IGOs. My suggestion would be in the exam that you'll be bullet pointing down some examples of IGOs that you've studied, in this case the World Bank, IMF and so forth, and then also write down what you understand what a liberal market and trade policy is, and some examples of how they have had a positive or perhaps even negative development impact on economic development. Let's have a look at some answers. Sample answer 1, trade policies are a massive stone for countries who are developing, such as those in West Africa, such as Guinea and Cameroon. Trade policies can be set up between countries, between a developed country who may not be able to produce certain goods domestically and a developing country who is able to produce these goods. This allows for easier movement of trade and allows for the source of income which will help these countries to develop. This answer is very broad in many ways, and it's not really giving me a strong sense of this candidate understanding what international government organizations are. Nowhere in this answer has that been mentioned, or perhaps in this paragraph even has it been mentioned that the IMF or the World Bank are important. It also demonstrates a lack of understanding of what trade policies are and doesn't give any examples of that, and starts talking generically about developed countries producing certain goods and developing countries producing other goods. That doesn't give me a sense of understanding of what economic development is and how it may be influenced. So overall, this would get you a low level mark in the exam. Sample answer 2. One of the reasons why IGOs promote liberal markets and trade policies is because they are heavily westernized. The World Bank and the IMF formed after the Second World War, and the global superpower then, and is still now, is the United States of America. This meant that the USA were able to set terms of loans and repayment to Europe during Reconstruction. These conditions then led the way in which the US established trade links, promoting their values. So the good thing about this answer on this paragraph is that the candidate has identified relevant IGOs such as the World Bank and the IMF. It's correct in talking about the United States after the Bretton Woods Agreement, setting up the Marshall Plan and helping Europe to develop after the Second World War. But the relevance of this question is not really quite clear what's being suggested or said. This is more like a history paragraph rather than a geography paragraph. And so it needs to focus more on probably trade post 1980 rather than trade between 1945 or 1946 up till 1980. So again, whilst there's some evidence that the candidate understands the premise of the question, there isn't enough detail in this paragraph to suggest that later on they may go on to write as well. So again, this would probably be, if we were assuming that they carried on writing like this throughout the rest of their answer, probably would get a mid-level mark. Sample answer 3. IGOs such as the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund all have similar goals in trying to help countries develop and improving trade. Free trade is a big thing that the World Trade Organization fight for around the world because it will help better business be conducted between producers, these importers, exporters, and buyers. Okay, so far, candidate has correctly identified World Bank and the IMF. The World Trade Organization acts as an intermediary between countries trading, and it generically talks about their role, or the World Trade Organization's role in maintaining economic order, but doesn't really give any details of anything specific yet. So let's carry on. Without tariffs on goods, trade can happen more freely around the world, allowing all countries to have access to resources they may need. Also, the less developed countries won't be taken advantage of as much and exploited, and instead be able to develop themselves. Okay, so theoretically, in the perfect world, this would certainly be the case. However, in reality, it certainly is not the case. And some understanding of trade blocks here, or discussion of the role of trade blocks in limiting particularly developing countries and their economic development, would show a greater depth of understanding of the issues surrounding liberal market liberal market and trade policies between developed and developing countries. So this paragraph potentially can go on to doing much better, and if the candidate did go on talking about those specific examples, then certainly this would be in a mid to high level answer. However, if we were just looking at this and they continued writing like this for the rest of the answer, it most probably would be a mid-level answer itself. Sample answer 4. The World Trade Organization or the WTO, World Trade Organization, has encouraged for trade to be fair and equal between nations and tends to oversee any negotiations between nations. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has consistently developed low-income nations via the use of loans and grants in order to create a more developed economy. The World Bank similarly provides aid to less developed nations to encourage development and growth to occur. So this answer has the potential to do very, very well. However, because there is largely descriptive and accurate description of what the World Trade Organization and the IMF do without validation or some examples given, this kind of limits how well this candidate will do. All right, so let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. The first sentence talking about World Trade Organization, absolutely, WTO does encourage trade to be fair and probably equal between nations, theoretically. What would be better is explaining how they actually demonstrate that, or how they actually do that in reality. Or you may want to write down how that is actually a little bit restricting, although this question is not asking for evaluation, it's asking simply what their role is. And as long as you're able to describe that in detail, you should be able to get into top band marks. The second half, the IMF has consistently developed low-income nations via the use of loans and grants. So this bit here is generically correct, but it's a little bit vague and would be better if a specific example was used. For example, we might talk about specific packages being given to Senegal during the 1980s or 1990s as nut prices were declining, to help them to be able to produce more. But then you could have talked about things such as the IMF encouraging liberal market economy within those nations by removing trade barriers, which then created other problems because farmers then didn't have access to seed or even fertilizers, and that then actually restricted those countries from being able to be developed. So liberal market economies, in some cases, can have a negative impact. And what that would do in the exam is demonstrate that you understand what liberal market and trade policies do for economic development. That's what you're trying to suggest here, or demonstrate your understanding of it. Writing broad generalizations about what they do is good, but it won't get you into the top band marks themselves. Sample answer 5. The World Trade Organization is an IGO which promotes trade policies for economic development. The organization supports the theory of free trade between countries with no tariffs, increasing mobility of goods between nations. Now, this paragraph is a very strong way to start the answer to this question. The reason why that's the case is because immediately the candidate talks about how theoretically they want to encourage, and then gives examples of how they might do that. For example, having no tariffs, therefore using key terms like mobility of goods between nations, summarizes what previous candidates you saw in their answers saying, developed countries producing more and developing countries producing for them, and long-winded ways of explaining something which could be briefly explained as this candidate has done here. The second paragraph, as well as lowering firms' costs as they no longer have to pay tariffs, hence increasing their profits, which then can be reinvested back into the supplied nation's economy in the form of infrastructure or increased employees' wages, for example. So the World Trade Organization encourages policies such as free trade in order to stimulate economic growth by decreasing the costs of importing and exporting goods. That is an excellent paragraph explaining the role of liberal market and trade policies in encouraging free trade between nations. And theoretically, if this happened, we developing economies growing rapidly and catching up with developed nations over time. So demonstrates that this candidate understands what the World Trade Organization is, what their role is using key terms like tariffs, profits, talking about infrastructure development, talking about policies, and talking about importing, exporting goods, which are all relevant to this question itself. If this candidate then went on to talk about a different IGO in the latter half of their answer, Certainly, this would be a top band 7 or 8 marks in the exam itself. Sample answer 6. International government organizations have a neoliberal view. Excellent start. Immediately, the candidate is demonstrating they understand key geographical concepts. Neoliberal view, where all countries should deregulate markets. Another excellent key term. Prioritize industries. Remove state intervention, absolutely, and promote free trade. In that one sentence, this candidate has already demonstrated to me that they have a very strong understanding of what IGOs are and what they do. And I know that if I read the rest of this answer, honestly, this would be a very, very strong answer itself. The view that if a country opens up its economy, it will see money trickle down from TNCs to poorer people, giving them more disposable income, which they can use to improve their quality of life, and overall country will become more developed. Absolutely. The World Trade Organization promotes free trade between countries by removing quotas and tariffs on imports and exports, meaning that the seller is able to make more money. This has not been strictly followed through, as it's failed to prevent the EU and the United States putting in protectionist measures, meaning that the countries can trade fairly and natives receive more money. An absolutely valid point, and certainly this candidate understands what the World Trade Organization theoretically wants to be able to do to be able to spread economic development, but then counters that by saying, however, trade blocs from the United States and from the European Union actually can have a detrimental impact and restrict liberal market policies and trade policies. The IMF loans out money to poorly developed countries as a way for that country to become more developed. In order for a country to receive one of these loans, strict procedures have to be followed, including where that country has to deregulate their market so money can move through easily. Privatize state-owned industries like energy and water and promote free trade within that country. This allows foreign TNCs to come in and invest instead of making money, these countries become in debt due to more of the money from these privatized industries going to the government itself. A brilliant paragraph once again. So this is really how you should be writing the exam. The assumption here should be that this candidate has gone on to get absolutely full marks, and certainly if this alone would get a candidate into the top band territory, 7 or 8 marks. There's no conclusion here, but certainly this would be up there. So to finish off with conclusion, overall, the HICs where these IGOs are based benefit more than the actual country. The World Bank has similar policy where they lend money to the country to start off development, and that country ends up being reliant on that organization, with the more developed country benefiting more than the country due to this free trade and privatization of companies. This is why IGOs promote liberal market and trade policies for economic development. So it doesn't need to, at the end, you don't need to write a conclusion for this answer because it's just an explained question. So all you need to do is actually say, here's an example of an IGO. This is what their role is in liberal market and trade policies for economic development. Here's another example of another one. This is what they do. However, there are some complications with this. Here's another example, and this would be perfectly sufficient for you to be able to get full marks on the exam itself. Okay, so we've gone through quite a few different examples, and I hope that through these examples that you've been able to see today is that there's a great variation in the quality of what's being written. Okay, so you can see from the earlier answers, they were, in most cases, generally, they were right about what they were saying. However, the way that they were communicating didn't demonstrate to the examiner that they knew what they actually were talking about. Okay, so you need to in the exam you must use keywords for globalization or health, human rights, and intervention topics. You've got to know IMF, you've got to know the World Bank, you've got to know what they do, what their role is. You've got to know some examples of that. You need to understand what structural adjustment policies are. You need to understand key terms that you can use to demonstrate to the examiner that you know what you are talking about. That is what's going to get you top level marks. Generically writing about what they do will not get you into the top back marks, which I'm sure all of you want to be able to do. So my suggestion would be go back to that table that we looked at the beginning of the video. Go make some bullet points on their role on economic development, those different organizations, and then write out your paragraphs very clearly about what they actually do and why in some cases this may not be beneficial overall for developing countries in particular. Okay, so practice writing your answers. Make sure that you're underlining the keywords in the question. Use keywords such as because, despite, some, but, whatnot, as well as using key geographical terms which are relevant to this question. So in this case, you've got to use those terms such as IMF, World Trade Organization, structural adjustment policies, and so forth. Free market economy, neoliberalism, and so forth. Okay, so my suggestion would be now that you go away today, write the question down, make those notes on that table first, then answer the question. Should take you about half hour, shouldn't take you longer than that. And then once you've done that, you've got another perfect answer. If you're not sure about things, you can come back to this video and review it to look at the previous answers that we were looking at. And then tomorrow we'll look at a physical geography question in a bit more detail to give you an idea of how you can improve on that front. So if there aren't any questions, I'll give you guys 30 seconds. Just let me know if you've got any questions or any requests for specific things. You can always, of course, leave comments on the video itself. I really appreciate that. And if you've got any questions that you want to ask, you can ask them there as well. Okay, guys. So in that case, I'll see you all tomorrow, same time, and maybe slightly earlier. Maybe start at 10, and then we'll crack on. Take care. Have a nice day.